When you think about the word love, what do you think it means? What does it mean to you?
Affection.
Affection, okay. What else?
Connection.
Connection, okay. Yep.
Caring.
Caring, okay.
Unconditional.
Unconditional, okay.
Genuine, maybe.
Genuine? Yeah, okay. Did you notice in terms of the types of words that you used, typically they fall into two types of categories. I mean, you could do this in different ways, but for the sake of today. So one is around the sentiment. Love is a feeling, it's a sentiment, it's a, like something we feel internally, okay? It's an action, it's a verb, it's a something that you do. These two sides of the word love, and for the purposes of today, at a very high level, we're going to use the working definition, and I'll come on to where this definition comes from a bit later on. But the working definition of saying that when we say love, what we mean is when I feel and intend and work towards the benefit of the other. So when I want the best for the other, for the beloved, that is love. Does that make sense? So it's the combination of I want the best for you and I'm going to act in your best interests. That's an expression of love. We get into the detail in a minute. Those of you who are familiar with the kind of Krishna conscious Vedic perspective will recognize this as Krishna's what's called the Rasa Leela, the dance of divine love. The reason why I'm referencing it here is because it's a really like the Krishna conscious kind of perspective on it, and as I said, we're going to look at this through the lens of spirituality, is that where does love originate? And the idea being that it has a spiritual status, it has a spiritual origin, and it is actually the sum and substance of the spiritual realm. And that love is exchanged by divinity towards the individual self. The theology that's explained in the Vedic tradition is about the individual self, all of us, being part and parcel of divinity. And that part and parcel of divinity means that which is contained within divinity is also contained within us to a smaller degree. So the idea being that the essence of the self is to love and to be loved. And in fact, in one of the kind of scriptural references is around that of the two most essential needs of the self, the two most fundamental needs beyond everything else is to love, to be able to express love, and to be able to receive love. And when you have these two things, everything else is. There's this point about love being a fundamental to the spiritual realm, for it being something which exists in eternity there. And that even further, and here you see, the fact that Krishna is replicating himself in these different exact replicas to dance with each of these individual gopis. So the idea or the kind of representation reflecting the idea that divinity also has that relationship with every single individual. And it's an exchange. It's a reciprocal relationship of love between divinity, Krishna as he's called in the Krishna conscious tradition, and each individual. That forms the lens through which the tradition looks at the idea of what is love and its spiritual origin. And therefore, when it manifests here in this world, the idea being the process of developing love ourselves and extending love towards others, that process is by definition a spiritual process. So again, we'll get into a bit of the detail. Does that kind of make sense in terms of the framing of the theme? Okay, so here, I love this. This is Shakespeare's Sonnet 129. Let's take a read of this. So the idea that the expense of spirit and a waste of shame, the spirit self, the endeavor, which is, a waste of the spirit's potential, and which is one that brings upon shame, is lust in action. So when we chase after lust, this idea that's, part of the definition of it, until action lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame. This idea that this is, it's just untruthful. At a fundamental level, there's something false about it. Savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. Enjoyed no sooner, but despised straight. So like he knew something about the dopamine cycle, when he's thinking about, you know, you really, 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 really want something, and then you get something and you don't want it. So that's when you know you're in a lust cycle, right? But despised straight. Past reason hunted and no sooner had past reason hated as a swallowed bait. I don't know if you can connect with that, but like that idea that, why did I want that? Like, you know, it's like swallowed bait. Like that's this idea he's making here. On purpose laid to make the taker mad. That's on purpose, that's the way it's designed. It's designed to make the taker mad. Mad in pursuit and in possession, so. Had, having, and in quest to have, extreme. So like that's the idea, like when you're in that situation, it's extreme. Like you have to have it. It's like an unstoppable desire. In quest to have and in having, right? So a bliss in proof and proved a very woe. Like when you get it, it's like, why did I want this? Like what was it? I mean, what was I doing here? Before a joy proposed, it always looks good. Behind a dream, it was never going to come to life. All this the world knows, well knows, yet none knows well. Like we all know it, but we still do it, right? So like he knew, like he got it, and he explained it in a way which is like very, not just poetic, but very insightful. This is the kind of juxtaposition of lust and love in terms of where love takes you and where lust can take you. Now the next slide, I'm just going to warn you, it's got a lot of text on it. You can close your eyes and I'll read it and it'll be fine. Just don't get scared. Okay. So remember I said that the starting definition of what we started with in terms of definition of love. So this is the guy who, where I got it from, a guy called Scott Peck. He wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled, a Christian guy. So again, so he's differentiating two things, okay? The idea of falling in, this is where falling in love. So you've got lust, falling in love, and then love, okay? If you think about it, kind of a bit of a spectrum. He differentiates between falling in love. We talked about lust. Shakespeare's given us that. He now is going to talk to us about falling in love and then love, okay? So the essence of the phenomena of falling in love is a sudden collapse of a section of an individual's ego boundaries, permitting one to merge his or her identity with that of another person. Does that make sense? Like when you're falling in love, it's kind of like there's the sense of, and he draws it back actually into how toddlers feel. Where you know that they're merging boundaries, but the idea that the identity of the self merges with the other person, so you're wrapped up in the other person. That's what's meant when we say wrapped up, right? So, like, and a sense of omnipotence, which we had to give up on in our journey out of childhood. Like this idea, when you're a kid, like he was talking about 2-year-olds, you think you can do anything. The world is at your mercy, and you are omnipotent. And when you're falling in love, you have that same sense of omnipotence that you can do anything. So, all things seem possible. United with our beloved, we feel we can conquer all obstacles. The unreality of these feelings, when we have fallen in love, is essentially the same as the unreality of the 2-year-old who feels itself to be king of the family and the world with power unlimited. It's an unreal situation, yet we feel it. We feel it very powerfully. One by one, gradually or suddenly, the ego boundaries snap back into place. That means you start differentiating from the other person, okay, over time. Gradually or suddenly, they fall out of love. They fall out of love. Remember, he's talking about falling in love, okay? All right. They fall out of love. Once again, they are two separate individuals. At this point, they begin either to dissolve the ties of their relationship or to initiate the work of real loving. So that's the point at which, when the ego boundaries snap back and you realize, you come back to your senses and you realize you're two different individuals, and the idea that there's that falling in love phase, and then there's what follows, then you have a choice. Your choice is basically to go back to your separate individual ego boundaries and there's no connection and you fall out of love and off you go your separate ways. Or you do the hard work. And the hard work here is talking about, initiate the real work of loving. Falling in love is not an act of will. Do you remember in the beginning I was talking about these two categories? One's a sentiment and the other one's an action, right? So the falling in love bit doesn't involve an act of will because it's just like you're off on a hormone trip, basically, right? So like there's something else going on. But Falling in love is not an extension of one's limits or boundaries. It is a partial and temporary collapse of them. Right? And this is where it's so different, because the extension of one's limits requires effort. We know that, right? It's stretch, don't, all of that kind of stuff. Practice and requires effort. Falling in love is effortless. When limits are extended or stretched, they tend to stay stretched. Real love is a permanently self-enlarging experience. Falling in love is not. You grow through a loving relationship. The heights are not suddenly glimpsed and lost again. They are attained forever. The temporary release from ego boundaries associated with falling in love, sexual intercourse, or the use of certain psychoactive drugs may provide us with a glimpse of nirvana, but not with nirvana itself. Does that make sense? Like you can, with all of these things, right? Like including drugs or whatever, you can definitely get some kind of experience, which is whatever, like the feeling of falling in love or the feeling of expanding consciousness or whatever that might be. But it's not a permanent state, and it's not a state which is actually enlarging you as an individual. It's an imposition on yourself. That's the difference. He points. Did that make sense? Okay. All right. So now, you remember the slide of Krishna dancing with the gopis, and I was explaining that is that's kind of the vision of love in the spiritual realm, the idea of how love is manifest and is kind of fully pervasive. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna gives an example. It's a really powerful example. We won't have time to get into the full kind of depth of it, but just to touch upon it. He says that there is a tree with its roots upwards and its branches downwards. Now, when you think about that, you think, is there a tree like that? But obviously what he's talking about is that it's a reflection, right? So the reality, so depending on which way you see this, if you flip this the other way around with a very, very high, good camera, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference whether it's this way around or the other way around, okay? And that's the thing with lust and love. So if your starting point, if your root is lust, the Gita is explaining you're looking at the material world, you're looking at the reflection. And if the root is love, then you're looking at the spiritual world. It's really that kind of basic. So Krishna is saying that what happens is when the self in the material realm, which is different to us, that's why we see the difference between conscious and unconscious things, the idea being that there is a spiritual self that is that is us at our most fundamental. That spiritual self, when it comes in contact with the material realm, what it perceives, what it sees is the reflection. That's what it's looking at. Now, to somebody who's just looking at the reflection, it can be pretty convincing. A good reflection can be very convincing. But until you touch it, right? So the idea is when we engage with the world, we see something or whatever it is, and we think that, wow, this looks really real. This looks like something I could really enjoy. But as soon as I touch it, as Shakespeare says, as soon as I touch it, it kind of it slips. And the closer I think I'm getting it to it, the further that thing is moving away. So that's that's like a kind of Krishna's explained, it's a fundamental difference between the nature of the spiritual reality and the material reality. Is that one is a reflection of the other. One is, it looks like it to the untrained eye, and to the inexperienced, it looks like it. But to somebody who really knows what they're looking for, and that's the whole point of spiritual practice, is that we can attune our vision to a spiritual vision which allows us to access reality as opposed to just focused on the reflection. So it's not like a reflection is false. The reflection is real. As long as you understand it, it's a real reflection. It's not a real tree. But the fact that you see the reflection means what? What does it mean, that the fact that you can see the reflection?
You've realized the difference between lust and love.
So if you can see, okay, so let's say you can't see the tree, you can only see the reflection. But what does that tell you? The fact that you can see the reflection. There's a tree. That's what it tells you, right? That there is a tree. So when we perceive this, the fact that the self is desiring pleasure, the fact that we perceive that tells us that we are meant for pleasure, that there is real pleasure somewhere, because it's a reflection that we're engaging with right now. There was a really fantastic C.S. Lewis quote. I don't know if anyone can find it, but he talks about if the self is not satisfied by things in this world, then it tells me that there is. Anyway, somebody find it on Google and we'll read it out. Okay, is that a bit clear? What we just covered just now? Okay, just to make sure. Yeah, okay. So then transferring that vision, so like, let's go on to the next bit. So, go, read it.
If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world.
Yeah, there you go, see? C.S. Lewis. Okay, so I think that was from Mere Christianity. So here we, now the question is, okay, I'm looking at the reflection, I understand it's a reflection, but I want the real tree, and what's the process of being able to change my vision, right? So, and this is where, again, the Gita comes in with a really profound perspective, is that process, at its most fundamental and essential, is about understanding what it is that you really want. So the thing that changes from that shift from lust to love, the thing that really changes is being clear about our desires. And I don't mean that from the perspective of, I want to eat pizza today, right? So I'm not talking about like fleeting temporary desires. I'm talking about at a fundamental level, do we want to engage with the reflection or do we want to engage with the tree? And do we want lust or do we want love? So we may be habituated to lust because that's our experience in this world. And we might struggle to engage with the idea of love. But the process, remember I said earlier, the process of engaging with the concept of love, right? That's a spiritual process. So the point is that as we change, as we start to shift our desire to trying towards love over lust, that whole shift, that process of spiritual life is the fundamental way in which this is the endeavor itself, just the desire itself to shift is the first step in that process. And that's why, like, you see in many spiritual traditions, like, it's when you boil it down past the differences in it might be ritual or language or text that they read or whatever it is, right? But when you get past all of that, at a very fundamental level, it's about something really, really simple. It's about something really, really simple in terms of internally, what do I want? What do I really deeply want? And when we start to recognize that, and then we can start to reflect on, on what that means for us in terms of the choices that we make. And it's a gradual process, no doubt. And that's the whole idea of a spiritual journey, is that it's a gradual process in transforming our engagement with the reflection to starting to appreciate the tree. So there are again, we don't have so much time right now to go through that, but there are some really fascinating frameworks within the Bhagavad Gita which help scaffold our journey from fully being absorbed in that reflection towards something that's higher. So Krishna makes like this really, there are some verses in the Gita where Krishna, they're called, I refer to them as the I am verses. And Krishna says, I am different things. So he's talking about where we can see Krishna in the material world. How do we see? Because Arjun, who Krishna is speaking to, Arjun's asking him the question, how do I perceive divinity in the world around me? Right? So we have this idea, God's everywhere. Okay? He's also in the heart. He's also transcendent. So, but when we say God's everywhere, what do we mean? And so Arjun's asking Krishna for some, like, how do I see that? How do I understand and appreciate and perceive that? And Krishna goes through a whole load of different examples, and then he says, I am sex life, not contrary to religious principles. And when I read that, I was like, when the first time I read it, I was like, why is Krishna saying that? You know, why would God say that? Right? It's not a typical religious text here. So, but what's really interesting when I kind of learnt more about what is meant by that statement is this idea that, depending on how you want to look at it, in terms of evolutionary process or the way that God designed it, but whichever way you want to look at it, the idea that, you know, for the relationship between a man and a woman, in that relationship, for the woman, it's described it's described how the woman can be the shield for a man. And again, when I read that, and typically when you read religious texts, they talk about the man being the protector of the woman, right? Whereas in the Bhagavatam, I read this thing, which is a corollary to the Gita, I read this thing where it's talking about the woman being the shield for the man. And I was thinking, how does that work? Like, what's behind that? And the idea was being that through the female energy, there is the ability to keep men who are more inclined, I'm sorry if this is not politically correct, but the idea that men are more susceptible to falling into, when it comes to sexual lust, falling into that trap and not being able to show restraint. They are less able to show restraint than women are. And by women holding that kind of position, because they carry the burden of pregnancy more than a man does, and that's kind of like, there's lots of kind of psychology research on that whole kind of thing about why it is that that's the situation, that society generally is kept in some kind of order, and that kind of role of being engaged in some form of separating lust and love, and being able to separate, because love takes work, as we talked about, and lust doesn't, and then being able to move towards love, but in a way that's kind of active and like as in service based, because that's what it takes. And I thought that's like it's an interesting way to look at the whole piece around about the role of lust and love, and the meaning of things like, why marriage institutionally is kind of there, why the relationship depends upon that. And the more you separate these two things out, the more you separate out, do you remember, like, we talked about lust being about exploitation, or like desiring to enjoy? So the difference between love being wanting the best for the other and working towards that end, and lust essentially being, from Shakespeare's kind of thing, is lust is when I want to enjoy myself. So I don't really care so much about the other person's situation, whatever. I'm concerned about, am I going to have a good time? Am I going to enjoy it? And love is the exact opposite. Love is that person going to be benefited in this scenario? And that's where this comes in, is that, when you separate these two things out, because love means sacrifice. It means taking on some austerity for that role. And that's why when we try and separate, and obviously society tries as much as possible now to separate out the responsibility that comes with marriage and pregnancy and raising kids from the enjoyment of sex. And therefore the idea being, one is focused on, let's just maximize the enjoyment of lust, and the other one's about how do you hold a regulated form of enjoyment in an institution which takes responsibility for your acts and is engaged in a loving relationship, as opposed to one that's based on lust. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so I think we're on the last slide. So last slide. So this is, as you know, I was being introduced about this. We have a group of schools which are based on spiritual principles, and we use the word love in our ethos statement. And when we first started using it, you know, not everybody was on board with it. It's like, it's a school, like, what are you talking about love? You know, it's because people have a certain perception of what we might mean by that. So I'm gonna read you. So we have 6 key behavior statements, and our last behavior statement I'm gonna read out for you. So it says, we are nourished and nourish others through relationships that fulfill our need to love and be loved, encouraging us to be the best we can be. So the idea that we're putting it kind of on the table, this is what we're about. It's a form of education which not everybody may buy into, that's up to them, but the idea is that we're trying to do something different in the education system, and we think that the idea of being able to engage with this, because, like, you know, you can imagine, right, if you don't provide the positive, the negative will fill the vacuum, right? Because the vacuum is not going to stay. So, like, unless you're focused on the positive, how do we skill up our selves and younger people to be able to engage in this idea in a healthy way, that they understand what the difference is between these different things? And then we've got 4 subpoints here. So the first one is, we place real value on relationships. So these are the things that explain that statement. So we place real value on relationships and the courage and hard work it can take to meaningfully engage in them. This idea that that's what relationships are. They're hard work, and we're okay with that, because that's what love means. It means that it's going to be some austerity here. We engage with love as a verb, centered on serving others. We are able to rise above the constant need for external validation because we are secure in our relationships with those whom we care about and who care about us. I mean, this is a big thing for kids. I mean, it's a big thing for everyone, to be honest. There's such a deep sense of insecurity often in society because we're constantly looking for validation from somebody else who I don't know, who I don't care about probably, and who definitely doesn't care about me. And that constant requirement for that person or that group or whatever to validate me, that's a serious problem. Like, it's a serious mental health kind of crisis, like one of the underpinnings of that crisis. And we just want to be able to share with the adults and kids in our school community that, you know, care about the opinion of people who care about you. Don't worry about, you know, everything else. And then we know that in the end, the level of happiness we experience is proportionate to our capacity to give and receive love. So at the end of the day, you know, everyone's trying to be happy with all these different kind of things that we run after to make us happy, right? So we all do that to some extent. But at the end of the day, what's going to make us happy is our ability to give and receive love. And that's fundamentally like, and the fact is that, you know, it's a bit of a, yeah, I mean, you know, schools don't teach you that, but actually there are ways you can teach that. And there are ways that you can help people, adults and children, understand the difference and understand how to engage with the process of developing a way to, you know, grow up understanding how those relationships can be built. So that's the end of the talk. 40 minutes. I did say it was 40 minutes. So I think we've got some time for a few questions. Yeah? Okay. All right, great. Any questions? No. Clear. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You have talked about love, and then other aspects of lust. If I say it's a kind of attachment to someone, means if we are getting attached to something in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So just like what I was thinking, in case of if we want to differentiate what love is and what attachment is, because in a relationship generally we are facing two things. Generally these two, we are attached. We say we are attached to them. We are just like this I am attached to that person, kind of.
Hmm?
So how I can differentiate and what is normal to me.
Okay. So yeah, so I would say attachment is slightly trickier, just because attachment can be positive or negative. Like you can be attached to the right thing, or you could be attached to the wrong thing. So it's not a it's a neutral word in that sense, right? So I think the difference between lust and love is that's where you may want to differentiate more, because attachment will come with either. So attachment comes with lust, and attachment comes with love also, right? So it's in both. So the key, I would say the takeaway in terms of how you can differentiate for yourself between lust and love, and that's about, again, part of the reason why it's a spiritual process is because spirituality is about also internal reflection, and then being able to change upon that reflection. And the reflection is this: am I doing this, or is my feeling driven by my desire to see that person happy, or is it driven by my desire for my enjoyment? That's really the simple kind of basis of what we're talking about. So if we're looking out for that person, that's more like love, and if we're looking out for me, that's more like lust. And that's why, you know, even like the spiritual tradition, the Christian tradition, like when it speaks about that pure love, that unmotivated, purely selfless love, it talks about it that the closest example that we can see around us, typically, is the love between a mother and a child. Because the love between a mother and a child is essentially as close to selfless and unconditional as you're probably going to get. So that's the idea, that's the difference. Because there's no lust there. That person is just working. And lust, I don't just mean sexual, right? So like lust can mean, yeah. So that motivation of the mother to look after the child is purely, pretty much. That's the difference. So is it for me or is it for them? And then that's a pretty, the difficulty is not in the definition. The difficulty is in being able to be honest with oneself about where actually the answer to that sits. Because if we're not used to it, because one of the things about spiritual life is, as you practice it, one of the practices you become accustomed to and hopefully better at over time is being honest with yourself. And that's not an easy thing. I mean, most people really struggle to be honest with themselves. Forget about the world. The world is whatever, right? So, but just being honest with myself. And that's a hard one. But I think as you get better and better at that, spiritual life becomes easier and easier.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. So when we're talking about love and lust here, because a lot of the time we associate the word lust with, say, like relationships, and
Yeah.
that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But then if we were to extend this to our friends, you said,
Yeah.
if you go back to the definition, you said lust is something where you're taking out a meaning for yourself, whereas love is something you're doing selflessly.
Yeah.
But then a lot of the times we're told when we're seeking friendships, when we're seeking a group of people to hang out with, you should do it for people who make you feel great about yourself. So is that lust?
Yeah, that's a good
Because
one.
you do love those people.
Yeah. That's a good question. So I would say that in our, when we talk about definitions, we're trying to be as clear as we can in a definition. The reality normally sits on that spectrum, right? So you've got pure, selfless, unmotivated love, which belongs to the spiritual realm. And we have the capacity for that. But we may not be able to engage with that in every interaction that we have. So there's a spectrum in terms of how far we're achieving that. But I think that, to your question, you see, the motivation, I think, is really important here. Like, I think you used the word, right? Like, what do we, like, and I think that if you look for a relationship with that motivation, you may be disappointed. Like, because you're setting yourself up for a fall. Whereas I think if you're going into developing that relationship in a way which is more balanced in terms of that person's benefit and your benefit, I think at least that's halfway. Because the other version is like, it can be, I mean, not narcissistic, but like, if it's all about oneself, then you run the risk of like, well, are they making me feel happy today? And it's like, I mean, that's just not how relationships work, right? I mean, it's not like, are you making me feel good every day? But then if you take it from another level, if by that what you mean is that they're making you feel good, not in a superficial like, am I feeling sensory kind of like, instant gratification, not that. But if you're saying they're making me feel good because I'm at my best when I'm around them, and I'm situated in a stable, progressive, like what we heard about in terms of enlarging and benefit, like that perspective, that's a different thing. Do you see what I mean? Like, so even by what you mean there, by feeling good about myself, you can unpick that a bit and really try and understand what it is that is meant by that. Because if it is the more superficial, transactional, exploitative version, I mean, that's heading for a cliff. But if it's about being the best that you can be, like, and your best version of yourself, that's great, because then you'll also contribute to that relationship.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I think, yeah.
I think you mentioned that to access the pure love, that we're able to do it in this.
Yeah.
How can we go about doing that?
I don't know. I'm trying to find out. But yeah, look, that is, I think fundamentally that is the spiritual path. Whichever like genuine spiritual traditions exist, I think that's what they're looking for. So they're engaging with it in different ways, and there are different spiritual practices which will work for different people towards that end. And I think there are, but if I generalize and kind of just give you an overarching view on that, there's two things that are happening simultaneously. One is the practice of going inward. So the practice of understanding oneself, understanding the spiritual dimension of oneself, understanding our identity at its most fundamental. So there's that inward journey. And then there's the external journey, not external, but the outward journey, which is the journey of reaching out to divinity and reaching out to, however you're defining divinity, but reaching out to divinity. And in that process, because divinity is internal and outward, in that process, there is an exchange that happens between divinity and the self. And that was that picture of the, do you remember the dance at the beginning, which was about that divinity reaches out to us, that there is a relationship that is eternal and has always been and always will be, but is forgotten at a spiritual, individual self level. And that process of reconnecting is the process of spiritual practice. And that spiritual practice can take different forms. So like in the Christian tradition, some of those forms are like reading Krishna's messages of the Gita, singing or reciting the names of the divine, meditation on the divine. So, different things which help us do those two things. One, go inside, understand who we are at our spiritual identity level, and the other, reaching out to divinity. And in that process, divinity is reaching back to us. And that's that whole, the symbolism of that Rasa Leela, that dance, which is that ultimately that's our destination, is a spontaneous, reciprocal, loving relationship with the divine. So yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a high level view, but the details of that in terms of, I referred to, like, there are frameworks in the Gita which allow us to live our life, our material life, in the material world, also in a way which is conducive to spiritual practice. So that's, like, for me, I did an MBA at London Business School. I've learned, I did some management consultancy, investment banking. I've learned all the frameworks that, but this framework called the modes in the Gita, I mean, it's the best framework out there. It is just unbelievable in terms of its potency to be able to be applied to any situation and to be able to enable somebody to take control of their situation, but also predict the future in terms of where that choice is going to lead to. Not at a functional output level, but at an internal status level, like where is it going to leave you? So, so there's that, there's the bit around how do I deal with the world? And that's that framework, which is, I feel is like incredible, about the modes of material nature. And then there's the bit around actually reaching out to divinity and reaching inward spiritually. So there's the lifestyle and the spiritual practice. But that's, you know, that can get quite detailed. So, okay, yeah.
So, whatever relationships you have, whether it's with friends or romantic or family, there are going to be rough patches, right?
Mm.
So at that point, how do you know? Sometimes it makes you evaluate whether that relationship is one worth keeping.
Yeah.
How do you go about evaluating whether the best thing to do is leave or to stay?
Yeah, that's again a really good question. I think there are some relationships where it's very clear that you should stay, like if it's your sibling, or I mean, generally speaking, right? So like, it's not abusive. So if we leave the extreme stuff out, because the extreme stuff is at either end of the spectrum, like full dependency or abuse and all of these kinds of things, they get very complicated because that, typically speaking, those are toxic relationships. Those are relationships which are harmful and need to be managed in a particular way. But if we're talking about regular kind of interactions and relationships, then those are around, I think there's a check-in point here about, I think the point that was made earlier about, if those relationships are elevating your state and stage of consciousness, if they're elevating that consciousness for you, like that's a pretty good sign. And I think understanding and appreciating that there is no relationship, as you said, right, that's not going to go through something. So then but there's also a piece which is that we don't want to become transactional in it, like, okay, here are all the pros and here are all the cons, and when this balance tips this direction, then I'm going to be like, well, what am I doing here? So like, in that sense, it undermines the fabric of the relationship because it's based on something more than transaction, right? So it's not just about what am I getting out of this. So that's what I mean by that level of, the word attachment was used earlier, because if we swap attachment for affection, like, because there are all these things that are roped into that, right? There's the affection, there's the time, there's the relationship, the actual, whether it's a family or friend or whatever, there's the potential dependencies involved in that relationship, a group of friends or a family unit or whatever. There's so many dynamics that go into that decision making. But in some of these cases, and that's why, the other part of our brain kicks in, which is different to the rational kind of let me divide it all up and let me see where the balance sits, which is kind of you're taking a global view of where that sits for you, and in some places that may tip to a place where you're kind of saying you want to take a step back. But I think the other thing I'll just say is that it's not necessarily binary either. The relationship is not just necessarily on or off. Like you can have a relationship where you step back from, but just maintain, and all kinds of degrees of that. So sorry, that's not a yes or no answer, but I think it's a complicated thing. So I don't want to give a stupid answer. Is that okay? All right. Yeah, just let me know when we have to stop. Yeah, okay.
How can we make relationships more spiritual? How do we add that spiritual dimension to different relationships that we have?
Yeah, spiritual, I mean, in the beginning we were talking about how actually developing love as that mood of selfless service and wanting to benefit the other is itself a spiritual practice. So actually there's I would say a couple of things. One is that just doing that for yourself in terms of the quality of the relationship, as in the quality of love and affection that you're putting into the relationship is a spiritual practice for you, right? And typically the other person responds to that. So one is how you're engaging with that and what you're seeking to get out of that relationship. So if your mindset is geared more towards wanting the best for the other, that's your spiritual practice. And you know, we were giving the mother and child example. You can see, like, we know, it's very clear from all the studies, a child that's been loved by their mother from, you know, 0 to 3, or even in the womb to 3, like, has an absolutely massive, disproportionate impact on that child as they grow to youth and adolescence and adulthood, in terms of their own personality, their security in themselves, their base level happiness. So you can see, like, there's massive impact in these things. And then there are other things, right? So there are things around, kind of similar to the point earlier about how do we live our life in the lifestyle perspective that facilitates spiritual growth, and making it a priority. Like, that's the thing that most of us, even though we might know the theory, we struggle sometimes with the practice, because it's like, how do I make it a priority? Because I've got 24 hours in the day and, you know, whatever, 25 are already taken up. So, like, how do I fit it in? But I think that's the challenge for a lot of us, is around how do we fit spiritual, how do we make it a priority enough that spiritual life becomes a thing that I'm forming my day around. And there are some really fun, interesting, engaging things that you can do, which has a spiritual focus, rather than just doing the standard kind of stuff that people do, like, you know, which you can do also too, but I'm just saying, like, there are other things to life. So, and for some people, like, you know, I know somebody, like, for them, like, where they feel like a real, like, connection with spiritual reality is when they're going for a walk in nature. It's a really big thing for them. So, like, they go for their walk in nature, but they're not just going for their walk in nature to get exercise. They're not just going out for some fresh air. They're not just going out for whatever. They're also conscious when they're going on that walk to see spiritual reality and the lessons of spiritual life manifest in nature before them. And that itself is a spiritual, like, practice, and it's an amazing thing. You know, there's a whole section of the Bhagavad where it's like talking about all the gurus that this traveling sage observes in nature and the lessons that it teaches that person. So there are so many things that we can learn if we've just got our eyes open, and that's the difference, right? Like, if we're staring at the reflection so intently and we're completely enamored by the reflection, and we're not even looking at the tree, we're just staring at the reflection. So even a walk in nature can be, you can get enlightenment, or you can just get some exercise. So it depends what you want to do with it. Yeah. Okay.
So you've mentioned a few times about how love is wanting the best, truly the best for someone. So there's a line between knowing that you should do that and then actually getting to that stage where you're doing that.
Yeah.
How do you get there?
Yeah, so the difference between I know I should do this and actually doing it like that. Yeah. So sometimes it's easier than others, because in some situations there's an existing affection which drives that. So, like, nature builds it in to that affection. So, like, the mother and child is a perfect example, right? So the mother's typically not trying to love the child. But even in that situation, which is, like I said, perhaps the closest you can get to spiritual love, right? Even in that example, there will be times, and you can ask any, you know, anyone who's been there will be times when the mother has to really apply their rational mind, because they're not spontaneously driven. Like, obviously there's a baseline which is spontaneous, but they're tired, no sleep, baby crying, you know, all of that stuff. And then something else kicks in. And that what kicks in there is what we were talking about in terms of in this example. What kicks in here is a sense of duty. Like I have a sense of duty here. So because that spontaneous, natural love driven by affection will work X% of the time, but there'll be Y% where I need to know that I have a role in this relationship, and that role carries responsibility. And that responsibility means that I need to bring myself to that relationship in a way that I may not necessarily be inspired in the moment, but I know that I'm inspired on the whole, right? Because we can have something in the moment and it's not really what we want, but in the whole, it's like, you know, eating healthy food. It's like, it may not be what I want right now on the pizza, but in the whole. So I think it's a combination of these two things.
Does that have to go back to, well, you're tired and you need to take care of your baby, but you have all these sort of emotions
Yeah.
kind of fueling this dissertation of what your true inner feeling is, so you have to be aware to come back to that inner feeling. Is that kind of...
Yeah, so say that again. Okay, I like that.
I was going to say, so you being the mother and then your baby's crying and you're tired, you have no sleep, and you still have to look after the baby, then these inner emotions, or these emotions are kind of telling you, I'm tired, I can't take care of the baby, I need to rest. And at that space is kind of to look past your emotions and to feel that inner strength again, the inner love for your baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that what you're...
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Well said, thank you. Yeah, so that's exactly it. You're tapping into what is deeper, right? Because you observe the other stuff, and that's where duty comes in. That's what duty is meant for, actually. It's tapping into something that's deeper, because I know this to be right. I know it to be right, but I don't want to do it. And at some point, it's like waking up in the morning, you know? It's like, I don't want to do it, but I know I have to do it, so.
I have a follow-up.
Yeah, please.
So, I think society now is moving away from
Yeah.
that sense of responsibility. in
Yeah.
relationships. With family, you do have it still. but
Yeah.
Now, with any other kind of relationship, there's that sense of, you know, we can leave this at any point, or there's
Yeah.
no duty here. What
Yeah.
do you think about that, or
Yeah.
how does that affect?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that is the material drive. The material drive is, let me separate enjoyment from the responsibility of that enjoyment. So I can eat anything I want. I have no responsibility for the sourcing of that food, the violence that's gone into that food, the ethical implications of that food, the environmental. I don't care about that. I'm just buying it off the shelf and I'm going to enjoy it. I have a relationship with somebody. I don't care what sits behind in terms of responsibility, the duty towards that person, the taking care of that person, etc., etc. I just want to enjoy that relationship. And you can extend that to everything. You can extend it to every aspect of our life. And it's not a new thing. I don't think it's a new thing with society. It may be more, I think society goes through phases, but it's been there for thousands and whatever millennia, right? Like there is a certain side to all of us where we want the reflection, and we just want to enjoy the reflection, and we don't want the responsibility that comes with it. So there is that side to all of us, and the whole, not the whole, but the kind of, I would say, half of that spiritual practice and spiritual life is about saying, I'll take the enjoyment in a way which doesn't compromise my responsibility. I'll take the responsibility in a way that keeps me within my ethical kind of framework that I want to be part of. So, so yeah, it's true. There is absolutely a conflict, and that's the human conflict. It's the human condition we find ourselves in the world, that we want this, and we know that there's something more that we should be cautious about. And so that's where spiritual practice becomes so powerful, because if you think about what is it that in that moment where you want something, you know, who is it who said the gap between stimulus and response is what defines free will? Frankel said it. So this idea that there's a stimulus, there's a response. Now with an animal, you have a stimulus and response, there's no gap. Stimulus, you get a response. With a human being, you're expecting there's a stimulus, you're expecting a response in a little while, because your intelligence is supposed to fill that gap as to, should I do this or should I not do this? Right? And that's the difference in the Vedic tradition, in the Gita, Krishna's distinction between the mind and the intelligence. So the mind can be used in the word mind can be used in different ways, but in this way, it's being used to distinguish the two functions. The mind is like, I want it, I want it, I want it, or I hate it, I hate it, I hate it. And the intelligence is kicking in and saying, let's kind of think about this. Is this really what you want? And this is not what you want. And this is not good for you. So that's the path of spiritual life. That's where, that's where spiritual life depends upon us being honest with ourselves. And because once we can be honest with that, like I'm doing this just because I want it and I have no connection with the responsibility that comes along with it, and then you still do it, at least you know what you're doing, right? Because otherwise we're just doing it blindly. We don't even realize the consequences of some of our actions. So spiritual life is the idea of helping us connect those dots, and if we are having a negative impact, at least being aware of that impact as a first step towards slowing down or stopping the more negative stuff that we can be involved in. And relationships are just an example of it, but yeah, it's true. It's all over the place, and that's why I'm so passionate about helping kids understand this process early, so that they grow. Like generally we pick this stuff up, I mean, I don't know when you guys picked it up, but I picked it up late teens, kind of, researching different spiritual texts and stuff. But by that time, I mean, your habits are pretty hardwired, right? So you have to work really hard to change those habits. You don't have like a default mechanism through which you're working in terms of separating out stimulus and response and all of those types of things. Whereas, if you're trained, if you're understanding these principles and you're practicing them, when you're a kid, it's just so powerful. It's just so powerful. So, yeah, we're doing some academic studies, for example, on the effects of yoga and meditation on kids in classrooms, and it's that type of thing to be able to evidence that. Look, if you introduce some of these simple, easy to do practices in your daily life, you'll change your state of being. You'll change your consciousness. You'll change over time. It will take some time, but you'll see it. You'll experience it. Even the journey, you'll experience the different stages of consciousness. You'll experience yourself at your best, and you'll experience being able to make those decisions and being able to separate, not just being like, Krishna. So Krishna gives Arjun gives him some advice, and Arjun says in response to some of this advice, he says, the mind is more difficult to control than the wind. Arjun's saying this, right? So thousands of years ago, he's saying this. And it's so true. Like today, we all feel it, right? The mind is like, who's going to control the mind? So the practice of trying to empty the mind or make the mind blank it doesn't work. It's an unachievable thing, that the mind is active. It's an active principle. So the real kind of mechanism to be able to elevate the mind is to be able to engage it in something better. So this is the crew that comes to the food. So welcome. So yeah.
I had a question because you mentioned it a few times, and you were talking about being self-aware and asking yourself questions and being honest with yourself. So say if you start this spiritual journey and you're being honest with yourself and you're spiritually aware, but you said a lot of people aren't that are around you. And then going back to the transactional thing, then how do you communicate, or how do you continue having these friends? Because I was reading somewhere that it can get a bit lonely as well, because then you start recognizing yourself but also recognizing other people doing things that aren't good for themselves.
So there's a book called, by our friend C.S. Lewis, called Screwtape Letters, and it's one of my favorite books, and it's so good because one of the key themes he brings out is that people on the spiritual journey, or on a religious journey in his language, they become so judgmental, and it's so easy to fall into that trap. The very thing that you're trying to do, you end up doing the opposite. Like the thing about developing humility and compassion and love, you start becoming judgmental. And it's like, it's an interesting dynamic. And you know, that's where we have to be cautious about that process. You know, I read a study, or a reference to a study, which said that people who do meditation are more selfish than people who don't do meditation. Now, how does that work? Like, what's that about, right? Because it's supposed to be the opposite. But the reason is that when a lot of people do meditation, it's just about the self. It's just about me. So you can understand, you can see how that could lead to becoming actually quite selfish if you're not careful. So the balance of how one practices meditation, and this was the point that we made earlier, meditation or spiritual life, synonymous. There's two parts to it. One part is going inward. It's the inward journey. But the other part is the outward journey. And there's the outward journey reaching to transcendence, but the outward journey also reaches out to other people, right? It's about helping the other, the definition of love that we've been using. Like seeing that. So that's why, like, to your question, it may well be that you perceive different things in your interactions, in your own spiritual growth, and you have to then hold yourself back from falling into that trap. But also being able to share, like understanding yourself, what's worked for you, what's been helpful for you. Because I think that's the other thing, like sometimes we can get into like theoretical, sharing theoretical kind of ideas or practices or whatever, but really what's very impactful is what's worked for you. Like what is it, what's genuine for you? Not quoting something. I mean, obviously you can quote stuff, but like what have you found to be real? You know, what's your truth? That whole piece. So if you have those conversations, I think people respond. I think people generally respond very positively because they know it's true. People can tell the difference when somebody's just talking and when they're talking from a space of realization. It's theirs.
Oh, I was just also going to add, like, when you do have that spiritual journey and you are connected to yourself, then you might feel lonely because you start to realize that the people around you are sort of feeling these bad emotions, or they're kind of diminishing you. So then you tend to stay away from them, and then you feel lonely. But the friendships that you do make are much stronger and more beneficial for you when you do make those friendships. So I think overall, the gain you have from taking that spiritual journey is powerful.
Yeah, nice. Okay, I think we're run out of time. So thank you so much for being so patient and engaging with the conversation and the great questions you've asked. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you around, and good luck with your spiritual journey.